Red dust rose in thick clouds behind the weary hooves of a lone horse. Nathaniel Carter leaned low in the saddle, urging the animal through the last stretch of road, eyes fixed on the horizon where Copper Creek shimmered like a mirage. 8 years gone. 8 years drifting from one cattle outfit to the next, from Kansas prairies to the cold Wyoming plains. And now every mile felt heavier than all those years combined, for the folded slip of paper in his breast pocket carried a weight he could not outrun. Mother is fading. Come at once. But he was too late. The telegram had been sent 3 days before it reached him, and 4 more days of relentless riding had only brought him to the bitter truth that the last chance to hold her hand, to hear her voice, was already gone. In his chest, an emptiness spread, dark and hollow as the sky above. It was 1878. Copper Creek no longer bore the rough-hewn face it had when Nathaniel left at 22, bristling with pride and anger. Now the main street stood lined with brick storefronts, the train depot replacing the old timber platform. But to Nathaniel, it all looked blurred, strange, as if it belonged to another man's memory. He reined in before the general store. From behind came a voice, rough but familiar. "If that ain't Nathaniel Carter, then I swear I'm looking at a ghost." He turned and found Hank Peterson, once the blacksmith, now silver threaded through his beard, frame still broad but slower with age. Hank stepped out of the doorway, iron dust clinging to his palms. He laid a heavy hand on Nathaniel's shoulder. "You're late, son. Folks are setting your mama's funeral come morning." No answer would come. Words jammed in his throat like gravel. Nathaniel only nodded, gripping the reins until his knuckles whitened. Hank studied him a long moment, then sighed and gave his shoulder a gentle pat. "The house is still there. You ought to rest. The town's changed. Maybe you need to as well." Nathaniel nodded once more, without promise, and turned his horse toward the road that led beyond the edge of town. The house waited, worn but familiar. He knew each crack in its frame, each tree shading its yard. The oak he had once climbed as a boy seemed smaller now. The porch sagged, boards weathered gray, but it was still home. He led the horse to the old stall, gave it water, then went inside. The key still hung behind the water barrel, just where it had been 8 years ago. The place was cleaner than he'd braced himself for. Firewood stacked neat by the hearth. In his mother's room, a comb still caught a few silver strands. Nathaniel sat on the bed, burying his face in his hands, the ticking clock cutting through the silence, each second a cruel reminder. A knock came at the door. He drew a breath, wiped his eyes, and opened it. The woman standing there made him pause. Her skin was warm and smooth as polished walnut, eyes amber bright beneath the fading light, hair coiled neatly at her nape. In her arms she carried a basket covered with white cloth. Surprise flickered across her face, followed by a soft smile, part condolence, part welcome. "You must be Nathaniel Carter." Her voice was low and steady, carrying both gentleness and strength. His throat worked dry. He nodded. "And you are?" "Clara Wilson. My father, the doctor, asked me to bring supper. He sends his condolences as well." The name struck something in him. Clara Wilson, the widow his mother had written about. She had come to Copper Creek 5 years back, alone after her husband's death to sickness. His mother had been the first to open her door, to steady her through those hollow nights. And now Clara stood at his threshold, eyes steady with knowing. Nathaniel stepped aside. "Please come in, thank you." She crossed the room with sure, quiet steps, setting the basket on the table. Out came bread, a pot of stew, and a small apple pie scented faintly of cinnamon. "I tried it the way she once taught me," Clara said softly, "but I doubt it tastes half as good." Nathaniel's gaze lingered on her hands, long-fingered, strong, yet delicate as they arranged the meal. A lump rose in his throat. "You knew her well, then?" Clara lifted her eyes to his, calm and warm. "Yes. She was the first to sit with me when I arrived, the first to stay through my grief. She told me loss isn't an ending, but a place to gather strength again." Nathaniel swallowed hard. Shame pressed in while he had roamed far. A stranger had stood at his mother's side, carried burdens he had left behind. "I should have been here," he murmured. Clara slid the basket toward him, her fingers brushing lightly across his hand. A brief touch, unplanned, yet it carried a warmth sharper than the fire on the hearth. She understood Nathaniel. She often said her boy was out living wide as the horizon. She was proud of that. He turned away, hiding the sting in his eyes. He did not feel worthy of pride. Yet her words, her steady gaze, cracked through some of the ice around his heart. Clara kindled a fire in the stove, then dusted off her palms. "Tomorrow's the burial. The town will be there. You won't be alone." She moved to the door, pausing in the glow of sunset. Her profile, lit gold against the dim room, seemed carved from strength and quiet grace. "Eat," she told him softly. "You'll need your strength." The door closed, leaving Nathaniel in the hush of firelight. He sat down, lifted the lid of the stew. The aroma filled the room, weaving into memories of laughter long gone. He ate, each spoonful both feeding his body and stirring the heart he had locked away. Tomorrow he would stand at her grave, face the hardest truth of his life. But tonight, with the warmth of Clara's fire and the taste of her pie lingering, Nathaniel felt something stir. Maybe he had not come back only to bury the past. Maybe, just maybe, he had come home to find something new. Morning light stretched across Copper Creek. Autumn sun, thin as silk, draped over the town. Nathaniel Carter woke in the old timber house, the place that had once held his mother's laughter, her lullabies, the smell of fresh bread drifting from the hearth. He hadn't slept much. Memories tangled with the image of Clara Wilson standing in the doorway, her calm presence haunting him with both comfort and ache. The house itself seemed to breathe her care. His mother had tended every corner, as if she believed her boy might walk through the door one day. A half-finished embroidered cloth still lay folded on the chair. A vase of dried flowers stood upon the table. The old porcelain dishes gleamed as if polished for a guest who never came. On the shelf, worn Bibles rested in a neat row, pencil marks scarring the pages with her steadfast faith. Nathaniel's hand brushed the cracked leather cover. It felt like touching her very resolve. He wandered room to room, each step slow, as though afraid to stir something sacred. In her chamber, the bed was neatly made, faint scent of soap still clinging to the pillow. On the table, her wooden comb caught a few silver strands. Nathaniel sat there, clutching the quilt's edge. I came home but too late, he thought, shame choking his throat. The town's church bell tolled, low and heavy. The hour had come. Copper Creek's church was filled to the rafters. Every bench, every corner was pressed with bodies. The whole town had gathered to honor the woman who had stood as their anchor. Nathaniel walked in, black shirt clean, boots scuffed but polished, yet he felt like a stranger among them. He sat alone at the front. Beside him yawned the empty space where his father should have been, gone these 8 long years. Sunlight through stained glass fell across his disheveled hair like a harsh stripe. Pastor Mills climbed the pulpit, his voice rolling through the silence. He spoke of Elizabeth Carter, the widow who had faced sorrow yet did not bend, the woman who poured herself out for the town. He told how she had boiled broth for fevered families during the sickness, read stories to children too poor to hold books, comforted widows left hollow by winter storms. Each word struck Nathaniel like a blade. He had never known, never seen. In his drifting years, he'd pictured her as frail, alone. But in these testimonies, she stood luminous, stronger, richer in kindness than he'd ever imagined. His head bowed, fists tightening on his knees as grief hollowed him further. After the service, the people filed slowly toward the hill north of town. The cemetery lay among tall pines, wind whispering through the needles like a hymn. A plain wooden coffin was lowered beside his father's grave. Nathaniel stood rigid, stone among the mourners. When the lid touched earth, his chest seemed to drop with it. The ground was taking the last of his family, and he felt emptied, untethered. At last, tears broke free. Silent, unrelenting, after years of being locked away. One by one, townsfolk stepped forward. Mrs. Lawson, wife of the baker, sobbed as she recalled how Elizabeth had sat 3 nights straight beside her fevered daughter. Old Tom Fletcher, leaning on his cane, whispered how she had brought meals daily after he'd broken his leg. A young mother clutched 2 children to her skirts, telling how Elizabeth taught them their letters, saying every child deserved a story before bed. Each memory sliced Nathaniel open, but each also lit a candle within. His mother's life was wider than he had known. Widowhood and an absent son had not diminished her. She had given what she had left to others. Then, through the blur of mourners, Nathaniel saw her. Clara Wilson, draped in a black shawl, her face calm, eyes steady as amber. When their gaze met, Nathaniel felt her quiet assurance settle into him. You are not alone. That one look eased something inside him. His breath came easier, his shoulders lighter. When the crowd thinned, he lingered. Clara bent to help an old woman retrieve a scarf blown by the wind. Such a small gesture, yet it struck Nathaniel. The town spoke of his mother as its heart, and here stood Clara, carrying that same quiet mercy, as if some part of Elizabeth's spirit had passed into her keeping. A hand touched his shoulder. Dr. Wilson, gray and steady, nodded at him. Son, I'm sorry it's under such sorrow we meet again. But Elizabeth, she went in peace. Clara was with her at the end. Nathaniel swallowed hard, managed a nod of thanks. The doctor moved on, leaving him staring once more at Clara. When she looked back, she gave the faintest nod, a silent promise. Grief would not consume him so long as he dared to take the hand reaching his way. Cold wind brushed across the hill, carrying the scent of pine. Nathaniel stood there, knowing he had lost a piece of his own blood, but not all. There was still life to be found, woven in the memory of his mother, and perhaps waiting in the depths of those amber eyes. The evening after the funeral, Nathaniel stepped into the silence of the old house. His boots echoed across the wooden floor, each sound reminding him how empty the rooms had become. On the table lay a pale yellow envelope, his name written in the familiar slanted hand of his mother. To my Nathaniel. His fingers trembled as he broke the seal. Inside, the script wavered, shaky with the weakness of a once steadfast hand. He read slowly, afraid to rush through her final words. My son, if you are reading this, I have gone to be with your father. Do not let guilt weigh upon you. I know you left to find your path, but Copper Creek will always be your home. Its doors open wide for your return. If you can, stay. Build, love. Do not live only for yourself, Nathaniel. Live, love, and let others love you. You are and always will be the pride of your parents. With all my love, Mother. By the time he reached the end, his vision blurred. The shame he had carried for 8 years almost cracked apart, replaced by the faint, steady touch of forgiveness. It was as though she had laid a hand on his shoulder, whispering, "You are forgiven." Nathaniel sat still, the letter trembling in his grip, while the fire in the hearth spat and hissed. A knock broke the quiet. He wiped his eyes, tucked the letter into his coat, and opened the door. Clara Wilson stood on the porch, shawl drawn tight, a small bundle in her hands. Her dress was plain brown, her eyes lit with quiet concern. I brought some herbs, she said softly. Father thought they might help you sleep. Nathaniel avoided her gaze a moment before stepping aside. Inside, the firelight threw their shadows tall against the wall. Clara set the bundle on the table and sat across from him. Silence stretched, broken only by the wind rattling at the shutters. I found my mother's letter, Nathaniel said at last, voice hoarse. She told me not to carry guilt anymore. She told me to live and to love. He stopped, eyes fixed on the flames, afraid to look at her for fear the words might shatter. Clara waited, then answered with quiet strength. She was right. I know because she told me the same. When my husband died, I thought my life had ended. But she said love doesn't vanish. It waits in another form, for when we're brave enough to receive it again. Her voice was warm as honey, filling the cracks in him he thought would never mend. Nathaniel raised his eyes and met hers. They held no pity, no judgment, only understanding. For the first time in years, he let himself exhale, as if laying down a burden too long carried. A gust shook the window pane. He rose to shut it, and his scarf slipped loose around his neck. Clara moved without thought, picking it up, her hands gentle as she looped it back into place. The space between them narrowed to a breath. Her fingers brushed the hollow of his throat, unintentional yet sharp enough to send his pulse racing. You don't have to carry it all. Alone? She whispered, eyes steady on his. Even the strongest are allowed to falter. Nathaniel swallowed hard. No one had ever seen him this way, not since his mother. Now this woman, with her quiet strength and unyielding gentleness, was stripping away the armor he had worn for years. He stepped back, searching for his breath, though a part of him resisted the distance. Clara only smiled faintly, settling back into her chair as though nothing had happened. This town has changed, she said, but it still needs men like you, men who know how to work, endure, and, if they allow themselves, care. Nathaniel sat again, silence thick between them. Then, almost to himself, he murmured, "Maybe. I'll try." Clara's eyes glowed in the firelight, her nod carrying more weight than any vow. In that room, with the letter in his pocket and the warmth of her gaze upon him, something fragile yet certain began to take shape, not forged by promises, but by the simple brush of a hand and the courage of two souls willing to meet. It was the beginning of a bond, slender as thread, but strong enough to hold against the wind. In the days after the funeral, Nathaniel refused to let grief keep him idle. He rose early, rolled up his sleeves, and began to take stock of the house and the land. What had once been familiar now showed its years of neglect. The barn doors sagged on rusted hinges, fence posts leaned and splintered. The porch roof had lost half its boards. Even the front gate looked ready to give way at the next hard gust. His hands were no strangers to heavy labor. Each swing of the hammer, each plank set straight steadied his mind, as if the work stitched closed the rents in his heart. Every nail, every cut of the saw was a word in an unspoken prayer to his mother. "I'm here now. I'll keep this place the way you once did." By noon, sweat soaked his shirt. He sat beneath the old oak tree, breath easing for the first time since dawn. From down the road came the crunch of wheels on gravel. He looked up to see a small wagon rolling toward him. Clara Wilson sat at the reins, her hair tied back, grip firm, a large basket in the back. "You've been at it since sunup?" she called, narrowing her eyes at the new planks along the fence. "Some things can't wait," Nathaniel said, wiping his brow with his sleeve. "I can't let the place go any longer." Clara smiled faintly and lifted the basket from the wagon. "I brought bread, salted meat, and herbs. I figured you weren't getting to town." He hesitated before stepping forward to take it. Their hands met on the handle, his rough and calloused, hers firm but warm. For a heartbeat, they both paused, the small jolt of contact passing between them. Then Clara, smiling first, let go. "You should eat proper meals," she said, a glint of teasing in her tone. "No one can work on coffee and anger alone." Nathaniel gave a short, surprised laugh, rare music from him these days. Together they carried the basket inside. Clara unpacked it with quiet care, talking about the town as she worked. Fletcher had reopened the forge. Mrs. Gonzalez was teaching letters to children again. The church was preparing for the harvest festival. Nathaniel listened, nodding here and there, a new feeling stirring in his chest. Copper Creek no longer felt like a stranger's place. It was as if the town itself was reaching out, calling him back. That afternoon, he hauled lumber into town to ask Hank Peterson for new hinges for the barn door. The clang of hammer on anvil and the hot smell of iron filled the smithy, bringing back childhood hours spent here, waiting while Hank shod his father's horse. Hank squinted at him, half grinning. "Thought you'd light out again. Guess you remember how to swing a hammer." Nathaniel rubbed the back of his neck, awkward. "I'm back, Hank. Maybe this time I'll stay." Word of his work spread. Neighbors began to stop by. Old Tom leaned on his cane, watching Nathaniel set new boards, nodding at the solid joinery. Children from nearby farms ran up to watch him paint the fence, eyes wide at the smell of fresh tar. Each face, each small kindness, was another stitch binding him back to the life he'd once walked away from. Clara came again on another evening, this time with a bundle of herbs and fresh vegetables. Nathaniel was hefting a sack of grain from the wagon. It slipped, heavier than he'd judged, and for a moment he stumbled. Clara was there at once, taking hold of the other end. Their hands gripped the coarse fabric together, shoulders nearly touching, her breath brushing his neck. "Careful," she said quietly, but firmly. "I'm used to it," he answered. Yet he didn't let go until the sack rested safe on the floor. They both looked up at the same time, eyes meeting. Hers were deep and still, holding a strength that unsettled him. He found himself wanting to stay in that gaze longer than he should, as though it could mend something hollow inside him. Clara broke the moment first, brushing off her palms. "I'll bring seeds for the garden. Mrs. Carter always said the soil behind the house would take to vegetables." Nathaniel nodded, a tightness rising in his throat. Even in her final days, his mother had thought of what might grow here, and now Clara was carrying those pieces forward, as if his mother's care still reached him through her hands. That night, alone on the porch, Nathaniel looked out across the fields washed in moonlight. A section of fence stood straight again. The porch roof no longer sagged. Small things, but enough to make him feel as though he belonged to this land. In his mind, the image of Clara's amber eyes and her soft, bittersweet smile would not leave him. He realized, though no words had yet been spoken, that a bond was forming between him and the town, between him and Clara. It was built not on vows, but on work, on shared hands and quiet acts. And perhaps, this time, he would not turn away again. Autumn spilled over Copper Creek, carrying with it the smell of roasted corn, ripe apples, and dry straw. Nathaniel had buried himself in the work of restoring the ranch, his days so full of hammer and sweat that he thought little of the town beyond its borders. But one morning, as he patched the barn roof, Clara arrived with a basket on her arm. She didn't speak at first, just stood beneath the eaves, watching him with that mix of sympathy and gentle teasing in her eyes. "You've worked all week straight," she finally said, setting the basket down. "Ever think about resting?" "Still plenty to fix," Nathaniel answered, wiping sweat from his brow. "The place won't mend itself." Clara stepped closer, her amber gaze steady, resolute. "Tonight's the harvest festival at the church. Everyone will be there. You should come." Nathaniel almost refused. He had grown used to shadows, to keeping away from curious stares that knew him as the man who left for 8 years. But the way she said it, less command, more invitation, stopped him short. "I'm not sure," he murmured. "Then be sure," she cut in, a smile flickering across her lips. "Your mother was the soul of these gatherings. She would want you there." The words struck deep. At last Nathaniel nodded, slow but certain. That evening, lanterns lit the churchyard and the square beyond, glowing warm against the cool dusk. Long tables were set with pies, smoked meats, and steaming pots. Children darted through the crowd clutching popcorn, while men tended a bonfire that crackled skyward. Nathaniel came late, dressed in a pressed white shirt and old boots polished clean. He lingered at the edge of the gathering, stiff and uncertain. Then a voice rang out. "Carter, didn't think I'd see you here." It was Daniel Morgan, an old friend now with a wife and 2 small children tugging at his coat. He gripped Nathaniel's hand hard, no blame in his smile, only warmth. "You've missed plenty, but no one's forgotten you." Simple words, yet they settled Nathaniel's unease, loosened something clenched inside him. Music struck up from a small band at the corner. Nathaniel scanned the crowd and saw her. Clara stood in the lantern glow, wearing a dress the color of wine, her hair loosed in waves that caught the light. Their eyes met across the square. She gave the faintest nod, as if to say, "Come closer." He stepped toward her. "I haven't danced in years," he admitted, half a jest, half the truth. "Then it's time you tried again," Clara replied, extending her hand. He hesitated, then laid his palm against hers. Her skin was warm, steady, anchoring him. The world around them blurred into noise and shadows, while the thud of his heartbeat filled the space between them. The band played a simple waltz. Awkward at first, Nathaniel set his hand at her back. Clara guided with ease, her steps graceful, coaxing him into rhythm. Soon they moved together, turning in slow circles amid the crowd. He kept his eyes on hers, saw the sparks in that amber gaze, the faint scar along her cheekbone that spoke of hardship, not weakness. Every detail made her more real, more alive, more unshakable. His grip on her hand tightened ever so slightly, unwilling to let her drift away. "You dance better than you claim," Clara whispered, breath brushing the space between them. "My mother made me learn," Nathaniel said with a wry grin. "She said she wouldn't have her son stumbling in front of ladies." Clara laughed, clear and bright, folding into the music. The sound stirred something long dormant in him, reminding him of joy freely given and freely received. Their steps grew surer, his hand steady at her waist, her hand resting light upon his shoulder as if in trust. Around them, the square swirled with voices, laughter, and firelight, but Nathaniel felt only the quiet strength of the woman before him. When the music ended, he still held her hand. For a breath they lingered, neither rushing to break the touch. The lantern glow wrapped around them, the silence between them thick with all that hadn't yet been spoken. The evening carried on. Nathaniel spoke with old neighbors, heard their memories of his mother, not with reproach, but with fondness. Each story welcomed him back into the fold, and each time he looked up, Clara was there, helping a young mother, steadying a child who had stumbled, or simply standing with eyes fixed on him. Every glance they shared tightened the unseen thread pulling them together. When the festival waned, Nathaniel offered to walk Clara home. They took the road beneath a rising moon, the fields silvered on either side. For a while they walked in silence, yet it was not a silence that pressed heavy. "Thank you for making me come," Nathaniel said at last, his voice low. "You needed reminding," Clara replied, her tone gentle yet firm. "You still belong here." He stopped and turned toward her. Her eyes caught the moonlight, glowing like embers in the dark. Nathaniel gave a small nod. For the first time in years, he felt tied to a town, to a woman, to the promise of a future not yet written. The road to Clara's house was quiet after the festival, silvered by the bright autumn moon that stretched across the earth like a sheet of silk. The faint scent of roasted corn still lingered in the air, carried by the soft wind. Nathaniel walked at her side, his steps slower than usual, as though he wanted to hold the night in place. Clara clutched her black shawl, her face turned slightly beneath the gentle light, eyes of amber catching the moon's glow. "How do you feel?" she asked, her voice no louder than the breeze. Nathaniel lifted his gaze to the sky, then lowered it back to her. "I feel like I've missed too much. Festivals like this. People who still waited for me to return." Clara's smile held both warmth and sorrow. "But you came back. That's enough." They reached the small wooden gate before her house. She turned toward him, and the distance between them shrank to a single breath. Nathaniel looked into her eyes, and within them he saw trust and fragility bound together. "Clara," he said, his voice rough, "since I returned, I've felt like a man lost, who suddenly finds a light burning in the dark. That light is you." Clara started, her hands clutching her shawl tighter. A breeze swept strands of hair loose across her cheek. "Nathaniel, don't say such things unless they are true. I've lost once already. I don't have the strength to lose again." He stepped closer, steady, unshaken. "I have never been more certain of anything. I spent 8 years running, but standing here before you, I know where I belong." Silence pressed in, filled only by the hum of crickets. Then Clara's eyes softened, shimmering with tears she did not let fall. Nathaniel lifted his hand, brushing her cheek with a tentative touch. She did not flinch. He leaned in slowly, and the kiss came, gentle, unhurried, weighted with all they had not spoken. It was no conquest, no desperate grasp, but a vow made through lips and breath. Clara answered, her hands resting over his chest, feeling the hard thud of his heart. The kiss deepened, stretching across the years of absence, filling the emptiness between them. When at last they drew apart, both breathless, their foreheads rested together in a quiet surrender. "Stay," Clara whispered, the words spilling from the deepest part of her. Nathaniel gave no promise with words, only with the sure clasp of his hand over hers. Inside, the glow of an oil lamp threw long shadows on the wooden walls. The air was touched with awkwardness, but not strangeness, as if this moment had been waiting for them all along. Clara laid her shawl across a chair. Nathaniel stood a step away, his eyes never leaving her. "I've learned how to live alone," Clara said softly. "But tonight, I don't want to be alone." The words struck deep. Nathaniel closed the space and drew her into his arms. The embrace was stiff at first, then softened, growing warm and tender. Clara rested her head against his shoulder, and his hand smoothed along her back as though erasing invisible scars. They found one another not in haste, but through slow gestures, through breaths mingling, through eyes that lingered longer than words ever could. The second kiss came with more fire, more need, his hands cradling her face while she clung to him as if letting go would scatter everything into smoke. By the lamp's dim light, they let their hearts guide. No oaths, no grand speeches, only the truth that they had found each other, after loss, after wandering, after so much silence. That night, they shared not just touch and closeness, but a trust reborn. Nathaniel felt the walls within him crumble. Clara felt the old fear ease away. Later, when the night lay still, they rested side by side, no words between them, yet wrapped in a peace neither had known in years. Moonlight poured through the window, washing the room in silver. Clara turned toward him, her fingers tracing into his hand until they wove together. "Do you see?" she whispered. "Life can still be gentle, if we dare to open ourselves." Nathaniel pressed his lips to her hand, his voice low. "I see it now. Because of you." With breaths entwined, they drifted to sleep, as though the storms beyond the walls could no longer touch them. And from that night forward, Nathaniel knew his return had never been about burying the past alone. It was about beginning again, beside the woman who had taught him to believe in love once more. The morning sun broke over the ridge, its pale light spilling across the roof of the old Carter house. Nathaniel sat at the table, a sealed envelope resting heavy in his hands. The wax bore the mark of the Circle T Ranch, Texas. He cracked it open, scanning the lines penned in a firm, deliberate hand. "We are pleased to offer you the permanent position of ranch manager this coming spring. The work is steady, the pay generous, and lodging provided. We await your prompt reply." Each word cut sharp. For a drifter like Nathaniel, who had lived by grit and muscle alone, such an invitation was a dream. A steady post at one of Texas's largest outfits, security, status, and a place among men of consequence. Yet the paper felt heavier than it should, too heavy. Perhaps the offer had come too late, or perhaps too soon. He lingered at the table, the letter trembling between his fingers, though it was nothing more than thin paper. Outside came the call of a rooster, the hammering of Hank's forge down the road, the steady rhythm of life in Copper Creek. In his chest, two voices warred, the whisper of the old road that had once defined him, and the quiet warmth of amber eyes that anchored him now. That afternoon, Clara arrived, as she often did, carrying a basket of food and herbs her father had mixed for Nathaniel's aching back. He stood on the porch when her wagon came up the lane, sunlight wrapping around her figure in a dark blue dress, her face half hidden beneath the straw brim of her hat. Nathaniel tucked the letter into the pocket of his coat hanging by the door, but Clara's sharp eyes caught something in his unsettled manner. "Something's troubling you, Nathaniel?" she asked, her tone as steady and careful as when she tended her patients. He shook his head, gaze sliding away. She didn't press. She simply stepped inside, set the basket on the table, and smoothed the cloth with fingers that trembled almost imperceptibly. At supper, the silence grew thick. Nathaniel listened to the clink of spoon against bowl, the sigh of the wind outside, until at last he laid his spoon down. "Clara, this morning I received a letter. From Texas." Her hand stilled on the rim of her cup. She recovered quickly, lifting it as though nothing had changed. "A letter from Texas," she said softly. "That must be a fine opportunity." He nodded slowly. "Manager of a great ranch. Good pay, stability. All my years on the trail, I never had such an offer." Clara smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "That is good news for you." Her gaze dropped to her plate, her expression betraying the faintest crack. Nathaniel saw it, the shadow of fear. Fear of loss, of the ground shifting beneath her once again. He reached across the table, brushed her fingers with his own. "Clara, I haven't decided." She lifted her eyes, cautious, uncertain. "You don't need to weigh me in the matter." "I'm not saying this because of you," he interrupted gently, pressing her hand. "I just don't know if I want to leave anymore." The next morning he busied himself at the barn, hammering boards into place, yet every blow rang like a question. For years he had believed life was only the ride, the endless road ahead. But now, since returning, something in Clara's gaze made the road feel less like freedom and more like exile. That evening she came again, this time with medicines. As she bent to set the jars on the table, a lock of her hair brushed his arm. The touch startled him with its simple, grounding truth, more real than the fine promises of Texas. She sat across from him, her fingers twisting at her worn shawl. At last she asked, voice soft as the wind through the pines, will you go? Nathaniel looked at her for a long time. In her eyes he saw the strength of a woman who had borne loss, and the flicker of dread that happiness once found might slip away. He reached to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear, his hand lingering a moment against her cheek. She closed her eyes, leaning into the warmth. I don't know, Clara, he said quietly, but for the first time I want to consider staying. For someone. Her eyes shimmered when they opened again. She didn't weep, but the forced smile she gave him was thinner than glass. That night, alone with the lamp's glow throwing his shadow against the wall, Nathaniel unfolded the letter again. He read it once, twice, folded it back with steady hands. Beyond the walls the wind pressed hard, urging him toward the horizon. But within him echoed another voice, his mother's words from her last letter. Live. Love, stay, if you find where you belong. Between those two callings he knew he would soon have to choose. The morning broke clean and sharp, the air rich with pine resin, and the damp earth left behind by night rain. Nathaniel sat at the wooden table, the letter from Texas lying open before him. He had read it so many times that the words seemed burned into his mind. But today was different. His hand gripped the pen steady, the strokes bold, final. I thank you, but I must decline your offer. He folded the reply, sealed it, and in that moment a strange lightness filled his chest. The weight he had carried for days slid off his shoulders. For the first time in 8 years, Nathaniel no longer felt like a wanderer. He belonged here. That afternoon, Clara came with a basket of warm bread, the scent of it drifting through the little kitchen. Nathaniel took it from her and set it on the table, then turned to her. In the mellow dusk, her face glowed, amber eyes lit with gentleness. You seem different today, she said softly as she slipped the shawl from her shoulders, as if you've laid down a heavy burden. Nathaniel smiled faintly, though his gaze was solemn. Clara, there's something I need to tell you. She paused, nodding once. He pulled out a chair, motioning for her to sit. On the table, a single candle flickered, its flame painting their shadows against the timber walls. I received a letter from Texas, Nathaniel said, after drawing a long breath. They offered me a manager's post on one of the great ranches, but today I sent my refusal. Clara's eyes widened, surprise flickering there. A hint of joy welled too, though she tried to hold it back. Why would you? That's a fine opportunity. You shouldn't. I didn't turn it down because I had to, he cut in, his voice firm. I turned it down because I wanted to. I've spent 8 years with no roots, no one waiting at the end of the trail. But now I know I want to stay, here, in Copper Creek. Clara dropped her gaze, her fingers tightening on the edge of the tablecloth, hiding the tremor in her hands. And what makes you so certain? Nathaniel reached across, laying his hand over hers. The touch was light at first, testing, then stronger when she did not pull away. You, he said quietly, I want a future with you. The words filled the silence, the candlelight wavering as though it too leaned closer to listen. Clara lifted her eyes, brimming with tears. Nathaniel, are you sure this isn't just the moment talking? He shook his head, slow but resolute. Never in my life have I been clearer. I can't promise riches, but I can promise I won't walk away again. I'll stand beside you, and we'll build something real. Her tears slipped free, shining in the amber glow. She covered her mouth, a soft sob escaping, not of grief but of release. The fear of being left, the old wound she carried, cracked and eased. Nathaniel's grip tightened. His voice dropped low, unsteady with emotion. "I love you, Clara." "Wilson." Her sob broke into a trembling smile. She freed her hand only to slip it around his neck, pulling him close. Her lips brushed his ear as she whispered, "I love you too, Nathaniel Carter. I've loved you longer than I dared admit." They sat together as the candle burned low, the sounds of crickets humming through the open window, a quiet hymn to seal their vow. Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, their fingers interlaced, as if nothing in the world could pry them apart. Nathaniel was no longer the restless rider chasing horizons. He had found his home, not just in the soil of Copper Creek, but in the eyes and tears of the woman beside him. Winter laid its white cloak over Copper Creek. Snow pressed thick on rooftops, fences, and tall pines until the whole town seemed painted in stillness. For Nathaniel, it was the first Christmas in years he had not spent on the run. This time, he chose to turn the old cabin into a place of welcome, a mark of beginnings. For days he worked at it. He scrubbed each board, polished the window frames, even cut a small spruce from the nearby woods, and stood it proudly in the corner. Red ribbons from the mercantile hung among the branches, along with a handful of old ornaments he had found tucked away in one of his mother's chests. When the candles were lit, the room glowed with a warmth that felt almost holy. He spread a white cloth across the table, set out the porcelain dishes his mother had saved for sacred occasions. He fussed over a pot of chicken stew, loaves of bread, and a pie recipe Mrs. Lawson had talked him through. It was no grand feast, but in every detail lay his care. Evening fell with quiet snow. Clara arrived wrapped in a dark green velvet dress and a simple fur-lined shawl. When Nathaniel opened the door, flakes clung to her hair, her cheeks flushed pink by the cold. He stood still, a surge of warmth rising in him at the sight. "Merry Christmas, Nathaniel," she said, smiling though her voice trembled from the frost. "Merry Christmas, Clara," he answered, taking her shawl and hanging it by the door. His hand brushed the snow from her shoulders, the touch slight, but enough to draw a shiver from her she did not retreat from. Her gaze swept the cabin, eyes widening at the sight of the lit tree, the table waiting, the candles casting golden fire across the walls. "Nathaniel, you did all this?" He nodded, a little awkward. "I wanted tonight to be something we would never forget." They sat down together, sharing the meal in a glow that felt warmer than any fire. The air filled with talk and laughter, the scent of stew and bread, the gentle hush of snow outside. Nathaniel watched Clara spoon her soup, her slender fingers resting on the bowl, her eyes alive in the candlelight. In all his years wandering, he had never known a supper could settle his heart so deep. When the meal was done, Nathaniel rose and reached to the shelf above the hearth. He turned with a small velvet box in his hand. His heart beat fast as Clara looked up, startled. He went to one knee before her, opening the box to reveal a simple gold ring set with a single stone. It was worn by time, yet carried with it the weight of legacy. "Clara," his voice caught, "this is the only treasure my mother left me. She told me once to keep it for the woman I would choose to walk beside me for life." Clara's hand flew to her mouth, eyes bright with tears. "I have lived long without a place to call mine. Nathaniel went on, his gaze never leaving hers. But from the day I came back, you have shown me what home means, what love means. Clara, will you be my wife? Time seemed to pause. Clara's hand shook as she held it out, allowing him to slip the ring onto her finger. Tears spilled down her cheeks, yet her smile shone brighter than any flame. Yes, Nathaniel, she whispered, her voice breaking yet sure. Yes, with all my heart. He pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a fervor unburdened by doubt or fear. It was no longer caution, no longer hesitation, only the union of two souls once broken, now made whole in each other. Later they sat by the fire, the flames snapping softly, snow thick against the windows. Clara leaned into his shoulder, twisting the ring so it sparkled in the glow. This is the finest Christmas gift I will ever have, she said. Nathaniel kissed her brow, his voice low and certain. And you are the gift I never dared to ask for. They sat long into the night, hands clasped tight, while Christmas wrapped them in a peace neither had known before. Winter crept away slowly, but warmth returned at last, spilling green shoots over the hills that ringed Copper Creek. Each morning as Nathaniel led his horse from the barn, he saw grass pushing up through melting snow, his own life mirrored there, sprouting from barren ground into something rooted and sure. Into a future with Clara. News of the wedding spread quickly, and the town embraced it as if it were its own. Women brought bolts of white cloth for table covers. Men cleared and mended the little church at the edge of town. Children picked wildflowers from the meadows. No one thought of it as a private affair. It became the first celebration of spring, a day where every hand lent itself. Clara had been shy at first, reluctant to trouble anyone, but her heart swelled as she watched the community gather. Your mother helped us all, Mrs. Lawson said, holding a bundle of white daisies. This is how we repay her. Clara could only nod, eyes wet, squeezing the woman's hand in gratitude. The wedding morning dawned under a sky of clear blue. Sunlight poured down in gentle beams. The small wooden church gleamed in simple adornment. Pine boughs twined into wreaths, white ribbons tied to posts. Jars of wildflowers perched on the windowsills. Nathaniel stood at the altar in a crisp white shirt and black tie, his hands clasped tightly to keep from shaking. When he looked up, he caught Hank Peterson's gaze, the old blacksmith who had steadied him upon his return. Hank gave a small nod as if to say, "You've found your road." The organ began to play. Everyone rose. The church door swung open, and Clara walked in on her father's arm. Her dress was simple ivory trimmed with soft lace. Her hair swept high yet left a few loose curls to soften her face. A crown of meadow blooms rested upon her head, making her both humble and radiant. Nathaniel forgot to breathe. Every step she took seemed to blur the world around her. When her eyes found his, she smiled, trembling but bright. He saw her fingers tighten around her father's hand, yet her gaze never wavered from him, the man she walked toward. Her father placed her hand in Nathaniel's. When her fingers settled into his palm, he bent close and whispered, "From this day on, I'll never let go." Her tear-brimmed eyes answered without words. The ceremony began. Pastor Mills spoke of faith, patience, and the power of love to survive loss. Nathaniel and Clara barely heard him. They only looked at each other, hands entwined as though trying to press the warmth of their souls into skin. When it came time to speak, Nathaniel's voice was deep but measured. "Clara, I was a man with no roots. You are the soil that made me stop running. I promise to stand by you in every harvest and every storm. I promise to hold your hand, as I do now until the end of my days." Tears slid down Clara's face, but her voice was steady. "Nathaniel, I thought my life had closed after so much loss. You came, like an unexpected spring. I promise to build our home with you, to tend this love with faith and patience." Pastor Mills smiled, his voice rising. "Then I pronounce you husband and wife. Keep one another in loyalty and in love." Nathaniel bent and kissed Clara. It was not hurried but sure, a pledge sealed in firelight and breath. Applause rose around them, but they felt only each other, heard only the beating of their joined hearts. Afterward, the whole town gathered in the yard. Long tables stretched under the open sky, covered in white cloth, laden with bread, roast meats, jars of preserves, and jugs of apple cider. Children ran between the benches. Grown men raised cups in blessing. Nathaniel held Clara's hand throughout, squeezing it whenever someone came to offer congratulations. Each squeeze his silent reminder, "This is real." Clara did the same. Amid the crowd, her eyes kept finding his. Each glance said, "We've truly begun." As evening fell and lanterns were hung, Nathaniel drew Clara into a dance. The violin's tune rose gentle as wind through new grass. His hand found her waist. Hers rested on his shoulder. They moved together, eyes locked, as though the world had narrowed to light and music. "Are you happy?" he murmured. "Yes," Clara said, her voice trembling but sure. "Because tonight, I'm not afraid of losing anymore." He bent and brushed a kiss across her brow, his heart brimming. Later, when the guests had begun to drift away, Nathaniel led Clara from the crowd. Under the thin new moon, he lifted her hand, watching the ring glint on her finger. "This isn't only a mark of our wedding," he said softly. "It's proof that you're where I belong." She placed her other hand against his cheek, her amber eyes shining in the dark. "And you're the man I've chosen to walk with, to the very end." Their hands tightened once more, bound in a silence richer than words, as Copper Creek's spring night wrapped them in the beginning they had made. That spring passed more swiftly than Nathaniel could have imagined. From the day of their wedding, the small cabin on the Harris place seemed to breathe with new life. Each morning, Clara lit the fire in the stove, her soft humming drifting through the wooden walls. Nathaniel often lingered on the porch just to hear her, before turning toward the barn where the scent of hay and warm hide marked the start of another day. They moved together like a pair long accustomed to each other, steady, wordless, sure. But life was never all gentle mornings. By summer, drought laid its hand heavy across the land. The earth cracked, grass shriveled, and the cattle thinned. Nathaniel rose earlier, riding farther in search of water. At night he sat silent on the porch, calloused hands twisting the brim of his hat, worry pressing harder than any words could show. Clara brought him a glass of cool water, placed it quietly in his palm. "You can't force the skies to rain, Nathaniel," she whispered, her eyes resting on the barren pasture. He turned, finding her amber gaze glowing even in the dark. Nathaniel said nothing, only clasped her hand tight, as if his strength drew from that touch. Not long after, Copper Creek faced a fever that swept through homes without mercy. Children and elders fell ill. Dr. Wilson, old but unyielding, still made his rounds. Clara, with the nurse's skill she once carried, went with him night after night. Many mornings she stumbled home at dawn, dress stained, face pale. Nathaniel waited on the porch, torn between anger and fear. "You don't have to run yourself to the bone, Clara. I'm afraid of losing you," he said, voice low, rough. She smiled faintly, placing her cold hand against his cheek. "I lost one husband to sickness, Nathaniel. I cannot stand by if I can help another soul. You know this." He pulled her close, breathing in the sharp scent of herbs and sweat, his heart heavy yet certain. Love, he learned, was not made only of peaceful hours, but of standing together in the hard dark. Autumn offered a fragile hope, but winter pressed harsher still. Poor harvest left the bins near empty. Nathaniel counted every sack of grain, every bucket of water. Yet at night they sat by the fire, Clara mending his shirts, Nathaniel telling stories from his years on the trail. They laughed, even while hunger and cold prowled at the door. It was in those lean months that Clara whispered the news. She was carrying a child. Nathaniel froze, then gathered her in his arms, lips trembling against her brow. Joy and fear wrestled within him. Could they provide for another life when they had so little? But when his hand rested on her belly, the fear gave way to a quiet faith. 8 months on, one storming night, pain struck her down. Clara cried out, sweat pouring through the air outside bit with frost. Nathaniel shouted for Dr. Wilson, but the old man's hands trembled with age. Blood darkened the sheets. Clara writhed, pale as linen. Nathaniel gripped her hand, heart splitting in his chest. "Clara, you have to hold on," he whispered, voice breaking. Her eyes fluttered open, weak, shining through the pain. "If I don't, promise me you'll raise the child." Nathaniel shook his head fiercely, gripping her until his knuckles whitened. "Don't speak that way. You're not leaving me. Not now." The night stretched endless, but at dawn, the shrill cry of a newborn broke the silence. Clara fainted, spent. Nathaniel cradled the tiny red-faced child in his arms, tears streaming down unchecked. Dr. Wilson laid a trembling hand on his shoulder. "They'll be all right. Both of them." Nathaniel stayed at Clara's side until her eyes opened again. She smiled faintly at the sight of him holding their child. He lowered the baby into her arms. Clara pressed her cheek to the infant's, then lifted her gaze to him. Nathaniel bent, kissed the sweat still on her brow, and whispered, voice unsteady, "You did it, Clara. You and this child. You're my whole life." The months that followed were filled with trials unending. Sleepless nights with the baby's cries, early mornings to tend the herd, fields still uncertain under drought. Yet each moment seemed to bind them closer. Clara, worn but radiant, rocked the child by the porch, her patched dress catching sunlight, her eyes glowing with quiet joy. Nathaniel, returning weary from the fields, needed only to see that picture, and every burden fell away. One evening, after the baby had finally drifted to sleep, they sat by the fire. Nathaniel took her hand, gratitude filling his eyes. "This first year, it hasn't been easy, but I've never known such happiness." Clara leaned her head to his shoulder. "Hardship only draws us nearer, and if every year is like this, I would still choose it. With you." Nathaniel kissed her hair, his arm tightening around her. In the firelight, their shadows stretched across the wooden walls, bound as one. They had faced drought, sickness, hunger, and the thin line between life and death. Their love was no longer a fragile flame. It was a steady fire, quiet yet enduring, strong enough to weather even the harshest winters of the West.